Hi everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Paratalk. And on this episode, I'm joined by the one and only Mr. Ciáran O'Keeffe. Hello, Ciáran.
Hello, how are you?
I'm all right. Quite excited to actually get you on an episode because I hear that you've been very busy recently with a brand new book.
Yes, yeah. In fact, the book came out today, and we've been working on it for a number of years, a book called Ghosted. And essentially, it's about the scientific research that myself and a number of researchers have been conducting over the last 4 to 5 years. We call ourselves the Global Ghost Gang, and we represent a spectrum of beliefs, everything from dogmatic believers to cynical non-believers and everything in between. But there's a number of us, and I kind of see myself in the middle of that spectrum of belief. But we've done a lot of scientific research and published it, but it remains in scientific academic journals. And what we thought was quite key is there's a lot of interesting stuff here that ghost hunters can learn from. So let's make it more accessible and put it in book form, and that's what you essentially get.
That's interesting. That's kind of like a workshop manual for anyone that's sort of going out there and investigating the unknown. Really, it's kind of
yes, yeah. I guess it kind of is. I mean, it's not telling you how you should ghost hunt, but because you're hearing a number of different voices, you're going to be hearing advice and kind of the science behind some of the gadgets that ghost hunters would use and whether they're effective or not. But also you might hear some voices coming through the book, not literally, but in terms of this kind of spiritualist approach and the use of mediums and whether or not mediums are appropriate. And that's what I mean. You get a spectrum of beliefs and therefore voices coming through the book. So I guess on the one hand, it is kind of a manual. You're basically getting a glimpse into the current state of play when it comes to scientific understanding or lack of understanding about ghosts.
So for those out there that aren't, well, I'd be very surprised. I think UK-based sort of people into the paranormal kind of know who you are because obviously, whole Most Haunted, you were kind of the logical one on there that would look at evidence and think, let's look at this from a little bit more of a logical stance. But how did you get involved with the paranormal to start with? What kind of sent you down this road where you are today?
I guess the road started very early when I was a boy and I was fascinated by ghost stories. I was reading M.R. James, H.P. Lovecraft, but also more contemporary authors such as Stephen King, James Herbert, and then a little bit later Clive Barker. And I was reading these at age 7, 8 years old, to the extent where my parents were genuinely concerned about my reading material. But that was an initial seed, fascinated by the fiction side of ghost stories. And then later on, kind of a very, very young teenager, it was the time for Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World and the Unexplained magazine. So all of that was a great show on the BBC at the time, Sapphire and Steel as well, which, all of that was around me. And I was fascinated by all of that kind of weird and wonderful world. And then the Ghostbusters came out in 1984 and I was 13 years old. And that was it. That was the turning point where I said, no, that is what I want to do. I want to be Dr. Peter Venkman and I want to have a proton pack and I want to have the fancy car and all of that. And that really was the turning point in saying that's what I want to do. But the reality of it set in very quickly when I started to do A-levels, kind of higher examinations when you're 17, 18, and then go into university, that the reality of what I saw at Ghostbusters it is not there at all. But it still planted that amazing seed of interest in parapsychology generally. So when I did my undergraduate degree out in the States, I ended up doing a parapsychology thesis as part of my undergraduate degree at the Institute of Parapsychology, where the science started back in the early 30s at Duke University. My university at the time in America said to me, "We're happy to entertain you doing a thesis in the paranormal." Those were their exact words. However, we're not in a position to supervise you. So if you can find a supervisor, then please go ahead. And I traveled down to the Institute of Parapsychology and did a thesis there, and then did a master's where I focused on psychic detection, and then a PhD in parapsychology with Professor Richard Wiseman. And that's really my journey. So it's a very academic journey where the seed of Ghostbusters was constantly running through.
So when we talk about the paranormal, haunted houses, ghosts, and all that kind of stuff, you had what I would say quite an important role in the television series Most Haunted, where you were the kind of level-headed one that would look at evidence and say, well, possibly it's this, possibly it's that, rather than it being the ghost of grandma or whatever. But how did that come across? Did you find any sort of conflict there where people wanted it to be a ghost rather than it possibly might have been something else?
You mean in terms of a conflict with the team that I was working with, you mean? Because there was
maybe the team, but also, the people that were making the show that wanted it to be something more. Because you had, from my point of view, when I'm looking in, the position you had was quite a lot of responsibility because you were the kind of the cool-headed one. You would look at it from a logical point of view, a scientific point of view.
Yeah, it's interesting because from a media point of view, at the time that I was on Most Haunted, and even prior to that, there's almost a regulatory perspective on it. Is that the regulatory body within the UK, which is Ofcom, dictated that there has to be a balanced viewpoint.
Yeah. And
if that balanced viewpoint meant, somebody get brought onto the show for a few minutes at the end, then that's your balance. So from a TV producers and makers point of view, they had to have somebody like myself giving an alternative perspective. They just had to. It was part of the regulation. Yeah. But in terms of conflict, it was interesting. No, there wasn't a conflict. And the way that there wasn't a conflict was, of course, my voice was heard, but my voice wasn't the main voice.
Yeah.
The main voice was the spiritualism type approach to ghost hunting, was the calling out, was the, isn't this amazing evidence, all of that, which kind of filled the show, as it does with most paranormal shows now. And then the little bit of skepticism and science is shoved in there. But I never had an issue with that. I never had an issue with that because you got to remember I was a parapsychologist before, and I am now. So a parapsychologist before the show and after the show. And so, people would never get to hear about the parapsychological viewpoint. They would never hear about that before, whereas the show went out to the masses, and here I was being able to give my perspective and teach people about the science and, why do you use an EMF meter, for example, or what is infrasound, those sorts of things. And I would never get a forum to be able to do that. I'd be stuck in my academic, scientific ivory tower, and nobody would hear unless they'd read a little article that I'd written or, read a scientific paper. So I didn't mind that my voice was brief, but also I was part of the three people that fronted the show effectively. It was Yvette's show, and she did an amazing job at steering the show. And then there was a medium and there was my perspective. So even though you might not have heard my voice so much, I was always there, even in the shadows, talking about the science. The conflict with the rest of the team, no, there was never conflict. We got on famously well. I guess the only conflict was the frustration that came from Yvette and some of the others, that I was constantly talking about the skeptical perspective, especially when it came to things like knocking sounds. If they're doing a seance and there was knocking sounds, I would always say, right, put the camera under the table. Okay, if there's no knocking, then remove the camera. Oh, the knocking starts now. Let's put the camera under again, and then put other controls into place. Remove your shoes and socks, and then I'll be convinced that there's nothing dodgy going on. So there was frustration in that respect that I could not be swayed. I could not be persuaded or convinced. There was only very rare moments where I'd go, now that's interesting, and I'm not going to say that I could easily explain it away. The vast majority of the time, I was constantly pushing the scientific, skeptical perspective. And that was frustrating for the other team, the rest of the team. But it was their own personal belief, and I stuck to my role, and they stuck to their roles, and we got on famously.
Yeah, I think with ghost hunting, investigating places that have a apparent paranormal phenomenon or any phenomenon that's going on, I think you have to leave. Like I've told other people, if somebody tells me to go somewhere, don't tell me anything about that place. Let me go there and experience what I experience. And then if I come back to you and say, I saw a knight on a horse walk through a wall, then they say, yeah, that's what happens. Then there's something possibly that's happening there. But what that might be, I have no clue. I don't know. So what I was going to ask you now was, because you've been to many places that have, alleged phenomenon and things going on, when have you been on location, or you've been to a place where you've had something happen and you thought, now that is just weird?
Actually, a number of times, and people might be surprised by that, given my somewhat sceptical perspective. But I call them head-scratching moments more than anything else. So, a couple of examples. So, there was a haunted nightclub which is now closed down in Birkenhead, which is in the northwest of England. And there, a group of people sat around a seance table, and they started to feel a little bit odd. And the only way I can describe it is almost like a fog of cold air I picked up on the thermal imager that surrounded them and stayed with them for the duration of the seance. And then when they said, it feels like we're not getting any more communication with the spirit, they were saying it as that fog of cold air kind of dissipated and went across the floor. Now, that's an odd moment, because you're getting people reporting their subjective experience. It feels like there's something around us. It feels like there's a spirit. And you get that in tandem with what I picked up on the thermal imager. So that was kind of viewing that. I've also had, an odd experience in SS Great Britain, a ship that was moored in Bristol, where I just felt spooked. I wish there was a better word for it, but everybody who's had that experience knows exactly what I mean. You just feel spooked. It just feels odd more than anything else. The reason why I call them head-scratching moments is a lot of these incidences and ghost hunting generally, the experiences are fleeting. Yeah. They're spontaneous, so you cannot predict them, and they're fleeting, as in they can be very brief. So they're gone. There's very little you can do in terms of going back and analysing what it is. I can only speculate about the possible explanations for those experiences, but that's all it is speculation. I can't, even if I went back and measured the environment in either of those particular locations, I'm measuring it years later. That doesn't give me an accurate measurement of what the environment was like at that point where I had the experience that might explain it. Yeah. So it's frustrating, but it's also exciting. That's why I love it.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say that SS Great Britain, I remember going there as a child and going around it. And of course, I think we did a show on it. I think it was quite a few episodes back now. We talked about some of the phenomenon that had happened there, and I got a message from someone who'd done a ghost hunt there, and they said that they'd experienced stuff on the ship as well. So yeah, that's good considering how old it is and how many people have been on it, and maybe. But moving on to something that I really want to ask you is the stone tape theory. Is it possible that our emotions in some way or something traumatic can imprint on its environment? Now, I did a show recently also regarding a pub in the Prince of Wales pub in Kenfig in Wales, where I played the original recordings that were captured. And obviously some of those sounds that they captured could be put down to electronic feedback, because obviously they were putting 20,000 volts through a wall. But some of those sounds that they captured are completely bizarre. You can hear people talking and what sounds like televisions and things being moved around and stuff. What's your thought on that whole kind of stone tape?
Well, I think it's a lovely idea, and it's got an element of logic to it. Mm-hmm. It's still a theory. Let's just be clear. Stone tape theory. Yeah. It's difficult to test it. It's not impossible, but it's difficult to test it. But I like the idea, the fact that the fabric of the building effectively retains an imprint of a past event. Yeah. And there's something that happens, either the living individual, or something about the environment triggers a replay of that particular imprint. And that's a fundamental, premise behind what stone tape theory is. And I think where you've got hauntings, where people report exactly that, a replay of an event where there's no interaction, it feels like that's a really good, viable explanation for what's going on, albeit a paranormal explanation. And whether it's seeing an event or, like you said with the Prince of Wales pub, hearing noises from the past. There's some sort of imprint of that sound on there. It feels like it's an interesting, if not, it kind of makes sense in a way. And it's probably one of the few theories that makes sense when we start to look at haunting phenomena generally. The only problem is, like I said, it's still theory.
Yeah.
Difficult to test, but certainly it's got precursors for it going back over 100 years. People talk about it as being, originating with Nigel Neal and a BBC play, Stone Tape Theory, back in the 70s.
Yeah.
But there's actually precursors to it. There's the water tape theory that was about 40 years before then. And there's other examples of scientists talking about the atmosphere or something in the atmosphere capturing an imprint and then it replaying it at a later date. You've got countless examples even before Lethbridge and the water tape theory. So, fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, we have the English Civil War, the replay of the battle that people were seeing in the sky and hearing the sounds and, many witnesses. What that was, who knows? I don't know. We have to kind of think about maybe playing a little bit of folklore there, maybe something like that. But I think that the stone tape theory, it's always fascinated me. I've always had an interest in that kind of stuff where people say, well, okay, maybe if it's a ghost, why don't you see cavemen ghosts? Why don't you see dinosaurs walking around? And I can sort of put something to the mix with that, and maybe if we are all energy and we pass on and we become out there in the ether, maybe that energy doesn't last forever. Maybe it does dissipate over time, and that we have cases where people see apparitions and they say, oh, somebody walking somewhere, and over years it gets fainter and fainter and lesser, but they still hear the sound. So maybe there is some way that we imprint on our environment if we do the same thing enough or are kind of emotionally charged at the time. I don't know.
I think that's a very good point. When the possible dissipation of that spiritual energy over time could be responsible for the fact that we don't get those, early historical figures showing themselves. But, you do get hauntings of ancient cultures.
Yeah.
You go to various parts of Egypt and people report seeing pharaohs and various other, hauntings and associated with that particular culture. There are even reports of figures and particular interactions with ancient Greek culture. But also, let's remember, if people are talking about cavemen and dinosaurs, I don't know if it has any impact, but you're talking about a world that looked very, very different than it does today. With plate tectonics, you've got a complete change in the landscape. So if you're starting to think about it in that way, potentially that might have an impact in terms of why we don't necessarily see the ghosts of these, older beings and cavemen, etc. It could be just simply down to a change of landscape. It's the whole idea that, you could have a haunting associated with a particular building. If that building is pulled down and something else is put in its place or nothing is put in its place, are you still going to see the haunting?
Yeah.
Now, I know there's some classic cases where that's true, but also you get cases where it's not true. You get some lovely examples, recently actually, of a number of prisons that have been closed down and converted by developers into flats. Prisons where people have reported haunting activity, and actually in the transitional period between it closing and being opened as luxury flats, you get ghost hunters going in and reporting phenomena. But then you get people moving into the flat and not everybody in those flats reporting any ghostly activity. So it's an interesting one.
So what's your thoughts on EVP and ITC? Where do you kind of what's your realm there? Have you ever sort of done any sort of research into it? I mean, I did some EVP research about 20 years ago, and I was quite into it, and I did quite a lot of recording, and I did get some responses and clear voices to clearly that there was no one else around at the time. What's your feelings about EVP and that?
I love EVP, so it's not necessarily something that's in the domain of parapsychology, even though we're interested in haunting phenomena, but it's only a small percentage of parapsychologists worldwide that have an interest in haunting phenomena anyway. Capturing EVPs, I love for two reasons. Number one, I love the history of it. I love the fact that you've got an approach to capturing spirit voices that goes back now about 70 plus years, starting with Raw Deve and Jurgensen, and these, Jurgensen especially, these individuals who were actually recording for different reasons, recording bird calls, and then when playing back the recordings, then they started to hear kind of murmurings and voices, and that's a bit odd, and then we're able to capture that. And I think it would be beneficial for current researchers and ghost hunters to look back at some of the early history of EVP to understand, how it was captured, and that it was captured on big reel-to-reel recorders. It doesn't necessarily have to be digital recorders as we use now. So that's an interesting part of it. I love the history. I love the development. I love the development of, organizations like the American Association for EVP and various names of individuals that did years and years of research in this. So I love that. I love the beguiling, tangible nature of that evidence that you see on ghost hunts, that people can be there with a little digital dictaphone or even their smartphone now, questioning, leave a gap, and then play it back, and you get some sort of sound. So I love it. I'm a big fan. The issue, of course, for me, is audio perception, where you get a very, very clear voice, very clear, and there's no debate at all what that voice is. If we're sure that it's not some sort of interference, then what is going on? Really question what is going on. I get sent recordings like that, and I have to question it because I'm sent the recording, so I don't know who was in the room or, what was going on at the time. But where you're in a situation where you plain as day hear a recording, I think it's fascinating. Those circumstances where it's debatable what's being said, I've got real issue with that. I mean, we know in psychology the whole idea of apophenia and pareidolia, that we find a pattern in randomness, that we're going to hear names, and you see it in some classic shows now. I think we might have even done it on Most Haunted occasionally, where you play this kind of static-filled recording and say, oh, they're saying get out, and as soon as you see that it says get out, you can hear it. But that's pareidolia. There's nothing more than that. So I am a fan. I hope you can realise that. But also there is a slight sceptical side to it as well.
It's interesting you say that. It's a late friend of mine. You might be familiar with him, Lou Gentili. He was.
Oh yes.
Yeah. He had his radio show, and he used to do lots of investigations. And he was a real advocate of EVP. And some of the sounds and stuff that he would record was completely bizarre. I mean, it was just growls and grunts and shouts and way off the scale. What they were, I don't know. But interesting that you say about us hearing stuff and the way that our brain is wired, that you would have you get it in the summertime when you put the fan on and you think, who's having a party? Where's all that noise coming from? And then you turn the fan off and the sound's gone. And you turn the fan on and then the noise comes back. It's that kind of your brain sort of trying to make sense of that ambient sound that's going on.
Exactly. Your brain trying to make sense of it, and you're absolutely right. And I was quite fortunate to be involved in Most Haunted, but all of the TV shows, and there's been countless.
Yeah.
And I'm always having this conversation every time I speak to a sound recordist. Mm-hmm. The sound man, the sound person on those shows, and I say, you have got the most amazing recording equipment. Have you ever captured anything like this? Have you ever hit?
Yeah.
No. And I've never met a sound man on these shows. And I'm particular about these individuals who are not ghost hunters. I'm talking about people that are part of film and TV crews, and saying to them, have you ever captured anything on your devices, any voices? And I haven't met one yet that said yes.
I think, it's usually on lower grade equipment that you have this phenomenon. And I think that, we could go back and say, in the olden days, in the analog days, they would use reel-to-reel and to capture their, voices and stuff. But it's a different, we're in a different era now. We're in this kind of digital era. And I was going to ask you, what's your thought? Because obviously we are moved from analog audio, from, analog style, taking pictures and stuff, we've gone to digital as well. What's your feeling on orb?
Very skeptical. I know that one of the issues with orbs was that it's a development of digital cameras, and effectively we're seeing a very good viable explanation in terms of the CCD chip within digital cameras.
Yeah.
That it's interpreting with a low pixelation versus a regular film camera. The low pixelation of the camera means that we're getting that light effect. We do get that. And it's a very good explanation where it was almost like it's interpreting either the flash bouncing off something, or it's just interpreting an anomaly within the photograph, which could be dust, it could be moisture, it could be an insect, anything like that, and it causes that light anomaly.
Yeah.
And it is a part of the digital digital world. We see them a lot. The interesting thing, though, is that in the past, and I say in the past, over 10, 15 years ago, I would have people come up to me and show me their orb photos and say, Ciáran, Dr. Ciáran O'Keeffe, could you please explain, this orb photo, is this paranormal? And I'd go through this whole diatribe of explaining what an orb was down to the CCD chip. And as I was saying it, I could see kind of the worldview and the enthusiasm just completely disappear from the person's face, almost as though when I gave the explanation, they just walked away with hunched shoulders, and I'd broken them, genuinely broken them. So now when people come up to me, and they say, Ciáran, I've got this orb photo, what do you think? Now my response is, yes, it's an orb.
Yeah.
And I don't say anything else because
you're playing it safe.
But it's also there's a lesson there for me as a scientist. I can talk about alternative explanations for things, but I've got to be somewhat respectful of people's belief. If they genuinely believe that orb in the photograph is the first stage of the manifestation of spirit of a departed relative, then it's wrong of me to go barreling in, two guns blazing, and saying there's an obvious explanation for this. This is the CCD chip in a digital camera. There's no way that's a spirit.
Yeah.
Whereas there's a way of delivering that explanation, which I've learned over the years through Most Haunted and through lecturing at university as well. There's a way of delivering that alternative explanation so that the person can still make up their own mind, but they're not offended and they're not ruined or broken by Dr. Ciáran O'Keeffe's explanations of orbs, which I did in the past.
I think you've got to be, when you do investigations, you've got to be willing to know that sometimes something most probably isn't or may not be what you think it is. For example, an interesting thing that happened to me was 3 days after my late father passed away. I clearly heard him call my name in the same room that I was in, as if he was stood in the room. I don't know what that was. It totally knocked me for six. I'm like, wow. I was wide awake. I was just chilling out in a room, and it was as if he was in the room with me. I don't know what that was. Completely bizarre. So, I mean, you've done a lot of ghost hunts. You've been to a lot of places. How do you think that ghost hunting has changed in the last sort of 15 to 20 years? Because now it's all kind of very gadget driven, as where back in the day it was a little bit more simplified.
Yeah, I guess that's the only fundamental change, is that we're seeing a lot more gadgets and a lot more digital gadgets and a lot more devices that have been specifically developed for ghost hunting without any scientific backing to them. So stuff like Ghost Box and Ovilus, etc. So we're seeing that. We're seeing new gadgets. But I think there's a bigger question here, which is how much has ghost hunting changed?
Yeah.
And you can go back to kind of the 1880s and Balecki House, kind of one of the first documented ghost hunts, as in written down, and go, to be honest, there hasn't been much change. There really hasn't. We're seeing a lot more because it's televised. We're seeing a lot more, digital technology involved in ghost hunting. But actually, in terms of a method and an approach, we haven't seen any change at all. And you still get different types. So you still get individuals that will kind of reject the environmental stuff and the gadgets and just go, no, we're going to just call out. We're going to use seances or Ouija boards or use mediums. And you'll see others who'll just use the gadgets and the tech and focus on EVP and ghost boxes and set up a REM pod, various things like this. They're set up in the hope of capturing evidence, where there's almost like a disconnect going. If we capture the evidence, it's a lot more interesting because the gadget has captured it, not necessarily us. It's almost like we're witnessing the ghost. So you're getting those two approaches, and then the majority of ghost hunters and ghost hunter groups will do a mix of both. But, some calling out, some gadgets, maybe a seance or table tipping, that sort of thing. It might feel like it's changed, but I look at the last 120 years and I go, actually, the actual approach hasn't changed. As a fundamental approach to ghost hunting, it hasn't changed.
So, as we're rapidly coming to the end of this episode, I have got a couple of questions I want to throw at you, and I'm going to be interested to hear what your thoughts are on them. So, if I was to ask you, how would you describe what a possible ghost might be? What would be your answer? What would be the way that you would sort of process that?
Well, the way I would answer it would be a ghostly experience can be any sensory experience involving somebody who's departed, but also actually a living person. So it's a sensory experience which has no natural explanation, really. And that's for the paranormal side. I guess a simple explanation, let me backtrack a bit, is it is a sensory experience in which we are in contact with something we can't explain.
Interesting. And my second question, which is kind of part B to my first question, with the poltergeist phenomenon, do you think that it is and something that we all have when we're young, we have this kind of ability, this psychonesis, this mind over matter, that as we get older and we become educated to the world, that there's a possibility that we lose this ability, or do you think that there's some sort of outside force, playing its role?
That's a really good question, because you're tapping into a lot of different things. Number one, in terms of children, why children seem to experience more of this stuff than adults. So there's a possibility that we lose something as we become more closed-minded and rational.
Yeah.
Even currently believers will have gone through that stage of being completely open-minded and completely ignore any rational or scientific or closed-minded perspective on what's happening. So there is that potential, yes. Within parapsychology, we talk about psychokinetic effects being responsible for poltergeist activity, but we're also open to the possibility of spirit phenomena causing the poltergeist activity. So it could be one or the other. There's no hard evidence, I think, for either, but it can be one or the other. But I like what you're saying in terms of there is that greater potential for children to have this experience, and it's because of that mindset.
Yeah.
Effectively.
We're kind of I don't want to use the word brainwashed, but we are kind of conditioned when we get a little bit older. We go into the schooling system. We're sort of taught to think a particular way, and as you get older, as a child, you lose those kind of innocence and that kind of mindset of anything is possible. And when you're by the time you leave school and you go to get a job, it's this is life, and this is the way it's going to be.
It's not only that; it's your family upbringing too.
Yeah.
So you mentioned about school, but if you imagine you have a ghostly experience and you tell your parents or tell your family, whatever their response is can potentially dictate how you capture that experience, but also then your viewpoint going on in life. If they're very quick to say, "Oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's a ghost. Oh, little Jimmy had a ghostly experience," you feel positive about it. You're happy to report those experiences. If immediately is, "Oh, don't be silly," then you're not going to report those experiences again. You're going to think about it. Or if the response is, "Oh, he's got an imaginary companion. He's got an imaginary friend." Different sort of response.
Yeah.
So it very much depends on the response that you get at an early age, how you develop those beliefs.
Yep. Imaginary friends, whole can of worms. I had a friend when I was a little kiddie, who had an imaginary friend, and he would talk to him and he would say, "Oh, he's coming with us," and we would go places and I could never see this imaginary friend, and he used to get so angry that I couldn't see him, and I'm like thinking, I don't know what he's looking at. I don't know what's going on there. He's got a friend and I can't see him, and he's always with him.
Well, watch this space. Later on this year, there's an article coming out in, I think it's Psychological Reports, authored by me and a couple of other authors up in Manchester, exactly that, looking at imaginary friends and our accounts of imaginary friends.
Interesting.
And how a lot of the characteristics of them feel like hauntings.
Yeah.
So look out for that.
Yeah, I was going to say, maybe it's the person that's being haunted, maybe they're haunting themselves, maybe it's connected to the poltergeist phenomenon. I don't know. It's massive. Anyway, Ciáran, so yes, we have got to the end. Once again, remind us about your book, because it came out today, didn't it?
Yes, it came out today. We're sitting here, 7th of July. It came out today, so it's a book called Ghosted, and like I said, it's exploring the haunting reality of paranormal encounters. I have it. All of my social media accounts will be announcing it. I've got a Linktr.ee link which takes people to the ordering page as well for it. But yeah, lots of information there about organizations as well, like the Society for Psychical Research and ASAP and various other organizations. If people are genuinely interested in knowing more, we're directing them to people that they can find out more as well. So yeah, hopefully it'll be successful. But like I said, it's a way of ghost hunters and members of the public learning more about the science, but not written in too scientific language, a more accessible approach.
That's excellent. Well, I'm going to definitely get that link to go out with this podcast so people know about it. So no worries there. And once again, Ciáran, thanks very much for coming on this episode. Totally fascinating conversation, and hopefully we'll get you back at some point, or even get you on a live stream, because that would be even better to get some the listeners asking you direct questions, because that's always fun. But so once again, thanks very much. Thanks to all the listeners. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly did. And we'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you very much. Love to come back, and lovely questions. Great chatting with you.